Chapter 18 of 100 Years of Modernism by Father Bourmaud. Chapter 18. Rahner's Anthropological Inversion. Just as in the earlier phases of modernism, the chorus of neo-modernists can be seen gathering around a leader, the conductor of the symphony of the day. Kant the philosopher had been the brains behind the whole of Protestant modernism. Loisy the biblical critic earned his rank as the world leader of Catholic modernism. To the theologian Karl Rahner goes the title of Prince of the New Theology, and with good reason. This German Jesuit, future professor of Hans Küng and Joseph Ratzinger, drank at the sources of the purest existentialism because he sat at the feet of Heidegger in Freiburg, in Breisgau, and was proud to claim him as his one and only master. Moreover, Rahner's doctoral thesis, published in 1939, was an attempt to reconcile Heidegger and St. Thomas. From philosophy, Rahner went on to theology. He considered it incumbent upon him to work the best of German existentialism into his dogma courses at the universities of Innsbruck, Salzburg, Pullach, Munich, and Münster. Heidegger might well dismiss such a project of existentialist theology as a contradiction in terms. Rahner was determined to forge ahead with his attempt to combine the uncombinable with the help of his friends Otto, Heiler, and van der Leo. Meanwhile, he also drank in the teaching of Danielou and de Lubac on biblical questions and the Church Fathers. Despite clashes with the Holy Office over his writings, he was appointed Cardinal Koenig's theologian at the council. In 1965, he founded the progressive magazine Concilium and was made a member of the International Theology Commission in Rome from 1969 to 1974. He died at Innsbruck in 1984, amidst the praise of his loyal friends, including Pope John Paul II. This is because Rahner, a true workaholic, had surpassed his masters by producing the most comprehensive 4,000 titles and structured synthesis of the new theology. On this point at least, his friends and enemies agree. Despite the diversity of sources that Rahner draws on, his system is remarkable for its coherence. Where exactly the coherence comes from remains to be seen, given that its author intended his theology to represent the definitive union of thinkers as, chapter 21, will show his overwhelming influence on the Council. 100 Years of Modernism divergent as St. Thomas, Kant, Hegel, Heidegger, and Maréchal. The answer to this question will give us the reason why Rahner's synthesis comes off as the ultimate in modernism. Many have crowned him as the greatest theologian of the 20th century or Novus Preceptor Germaniae, Germany's new teacher. We believe he would be better labeled as the man who launched a new age in the Church. We shall here firstly expose the nature and consequences of Rahner's philosophy, his anthropological inversion, or turning towards man, the last word in modernism, before going on to criticize the system. Since we hold Rahner to represent the apogee of modernism and the main key to understanding Vatican II and John Paul II, we shall beg the reader's indulgence if the following pages, which seem crucial to us, make for difficult reading. The sources of Rahner's philosophy. Before attempting to follow Rahner's meandering theology, we must first establish the precise nature of the philosophy which he took as the foundation and keystone of his whole dogmatic system. Rahner does not hide his sources. They are Kant and Heidegger, but also Hegel, even if Rahner remains a little more discreet about Hegel's contribution. Rahner leans also on his Belgian colleague Farquhar. Maréchal, in his attempt to build bridges between Kant and St. Thomas, thus beginning with immanentism and ending in realism, Rahner explains the process in his Innsbruck doctoral thesis, Spirit in the World. The thesis was rejected by Rahner's instructor but was published soon after. The inspiration of all three German authors is already visible in Rahner's early work. In his treatment of the process of knowing, St. Thomas explains that the thing known is received according to the capacity of the knower. This is the principle which Rahner would invoke to justify his venture into Kantianism. Rahner adopted Kant's transcendental method whereby Gymia. Everything in this chapter is drawn from Rahner's own works or authorized commentaries, including Fabro, La Avventura Progressista, and La Svolta Antropologica decay. Rahner, Cardinal Siri, Gethsemane, Spadafora, La Tradizione, Contro il Concilio, L'Apertura, A Sinistra del Vaticano, 2, 1989. Mainville, Della Cabala al Progressismo, Courier de Rome, Eglise contre Eglise, La Tradizione Cattolica, number 40. Rimini, 1999. Our principal reference and our source for passages from Rahner himself when not otherwise indicated will be Ferraro's El Naufragio del Progressismo, Shipwreck of Progressivism, Peru, Arequipa, 1999. Geist in Welt, English translation by William Deitch, S.J. New York, Herder and Herder, 1968. Professor Honecker rejected the thesis on the grounds that it falsified Saintson. Thomas Aquinas' teaching by crediting him with views he did not hold. See Vorgermler, Karl Rahner, Verstehen. Understanding Karl Rahner, p.78 in Courier de Rome, Eglise contre Eglise, p.375. Rahner's anthropological inversion. Knowledge has two sources, both the known object and the process of knowing. The matter of knowledge comes from the object. The form of knowledge, on the contrary, comes from the knower, or the knowing subject. Henceforth, reality is ruled by thinking and not thinking by reality. Henceforth, thought bestows upon knowledge an essential structure, with the result that we can no longer know the factual reality or being of a thing, but only its appearance or the phenomenon. Kant is here stating the double principle of immanentism and egology. To unify the various levels of knowledge, sensation, intellection, and reason, Kant appeals to their common foundation, which brings him back to Descartes' cogito, I think. Ich denke überhaupt, I just think, cogito, but emptied out of any object of thought. However, Kant's system is not fully satisfactory because it stops halfway down the egological slope. How can Kant speak of any object of consciousness which would be other than the consciousness itself? How can he preserve truth when the form and matter of knowledge are not united? Behold Hegel's objection to Kant, and Hegel is right, because once one starts out from the cogito, everything must be an unfolding of the conscious I. The object becomes the subject, the thing known is represented before itself so as to produce knowledge. This reflexive process of presentation of consciousness unfolding is truth. Hegel is the great advocate of the principle of consciousness. Turning in an egological circle, thought emerges from the consciousness to meet with an object which is, finally, nothing other than the exteriorization or outward projection of the same consciousness. The process comes full circle with a glorification of the will at the expense of mind and being, which is the principle of cogito volo, I think, I will, it is. Tied to this egology is a certain principle of projection which reduces being to a mere emanation and presentation of the consciousness. For Hegel, being is simply appearance, Schein. For Heidegger, being is but an exhibition inside the theater of consciousness, and man is where being dwells and manifests itself. Man could be defined as the theater in which being makes its premier performance, hence Rahner leans rather to the side of Heidegger than of Kant. On the other hand, Heidegger absolutely refused any appeal to a beyond. In Heidegger's world of facts of consciousness, successively presented in the theater of human history and consciousness, there is no place for a divine absolute towering above the horizon of man's time and space. Rahner, however, wished to found a philosophy open to God and hence capable of undergirding a theology. He therefore had to part ways with Heidegger's existentialism and catch up with Hegel. Man is the place where being dwells in the theater of revelation, Heidegger. He is also where dwells the absolute Hegel, and that absolute is God Rahner. 100 years of modernism. Hegel's system allows for a double dialectic. We are already familiar with the first, his dynamic dialectic, a three-step waltz in which opposite extremes, thesis and antithesis, meet, and finally unite. Synthesis, according to the trinomial being, nothingness, becoming. This dynamic dialectic terminates in one of the two poles of Hegel's second dialectic, which is static. The static or metaphysical dialectic, our main interest for the moment, comprises two correlative and complementary poles, God and the world, or the infinite and the finite, or being and appearance. Thus, the climax of Hegel's dynamic dialectical evolution comes when the infinite finally becomes aware of itself. This awareness can only arise from a contrast with the finite. The self-awareness of the infinite explains the emergence of the finite, a simple mediator for revealing the infinite to itself. Just as sound needs a resonating body before it can hear its own echo, and just as the magnetic energy of thunder needs the Earth's neutral pole to make the lightning flash, so the Absolute needs a mirror in which to be reflected and thus know itself. Hegel therefore defined the finite as the infinite alienated from itself and becoming another, thereby becoming capable of revealing itself to itself and of digesting the richness of its own infinite substance. The finite is the thought and activity of man as a spirit, who thus permits the absolute God to exist. We might ask where Hegel could possibly have come up with such a dialectic intended to bridge the immeasurable gap between creation and its author. Hegel himself explained that the Christian revelation of God's incarnation, reconciliation of the finite with the infinite, is what led him to his discovery of the reflexive energy of cosmic infinitude. According to the Christian faith, the Holy Trinity, i.e., God turned inward, brought about the incarnation, the finite, or the self-alienated infinite, permitting the manifestation and communication of his own word, God turned outward. Hegel transposed the incarnation to echo his own philosophy. Being in itself needs being outside, itself to become being for itself. Pure reality needs finite reality to become aware of itself. However, did Hegel really see the finite world as truly distinct from the infinite God? In fact, not at all. The two contraries are distinct, but they are also inseparable, since the infinite necessarily draws forth the finite for the infinite's own self-revelation. This aspect alone suffices to throw a pantheistic cast over Hegel's dialectic. Graver yet, according to Hegel, the two poles are merely preparatory stages in a movement toward their final union, which will at last be a step beyond the categories of finite and infinite. Truth to tell, the awareness, concept, image, and echo, which the Absolute acquires of itself through the finite, are worth more than either the Absolute or the finite taken on their own. Historians of philosophy concur in Deffen, Rahner's anthropological inversion, eyeing the Hegelian dialectic as the most radical and logical pantheism ever conceived by the human mind. On this basis, Rahner concocted a skillful blend of modern philosophers, all the while invoking St. Thomas. He began with Heidegger, St. Chao. Thomas had explained the circle of knowledge as a double movement, advancing from the concrete thing to its abstract essence, and then returning to the concrete sensible, abstraction, conversion, return. Rahner began with this realist circle of knowledge, but ended up with the immanentist circle, I think. I will, it is. From the outset, sensation and intellection are identical within the dialectic because sensation emanates from the finite spirit as its projection, and is part of the same overall movement of thought. To make matters worse, Rahner engaged in phenomenological reduction, by which being and being known are one and the same reality. The intellect and the known and the knowing are the same. Being in itself is being known. Bro. The he known is always the being of the knower, Durono. No. For Rahner, the problem is inverted. How is it possible to distinguish the knowing subject from the object known? The Jesuit forged ahead ever deeper, bringing his philosophy full circle with the absolute voluntarism of the cogito volo bot one. And if spirit is to be defined as the full possession of oneself and of one's creative power over oneself, then it is perfectly defined as liberty and will. 1111, man then is to be defined as liberty and as imitation of the power of God's free love, which in itself is luminous and creative and is fundamentally a love for himself that engenders being. 12. After confining himself to the egological circle of the existentialists, Rahner turned to follow the only way to break out of the egological circle closing around one like Pa I Bede, point 7er, i.e. Bede, point 69. Rahner hijacks the Thomistic adage, ens verum et bonum convertuntur, being, truth, and good are equivalent. Heidegger says the same thing. The essence of truth is liberty. Rahner, Hearers de Wortes, English edition, Hearers of the Word, translated by Michael Richards, New York, Herder and Herder Inc., 1969, p.102. Rahner, Hearers of the Word, p.101. 100 Years of Modernism. A prison is by knowledge of the infinite. If the finite reality exists, it demands or presupposes. For Griff, by negation, the existence of an infinite, which is absolute. It is only logical. For Rahner, man is a capacity and an infinite space never filled. He comes forth as a question. Now, every question requires a proportionate answer, and the answer corresponding to an infinite question can only be God. And this question, this infinite expectation, must be real because it is inconceivable that it be only possible. 13. If man really is a subject, that is, a transcendent, responsible, and free being, then basically this has already been said that man is a being oriented towards God. 14. Here is no knowledge of God which is purely natural. 15. Man is quodammodo omnias, in a certain way everything, insofar as he knows, absolute being by his pre-apprehension. 16. Every knowledge of another by man is a mode. Now this holds also for man's knowledge of God. 17. After our lightning tour of the various philosophical contributions to Rahner's thought, it is clear that his greatest debt is to Hegel. Without this key to understanding Rahner, his system would appear merely labyrinthine. It would be difficult to make heads or tails of his incomprehensible doctrine. However, seen in the light of Hegelianism, everything suddenly starts to make sense. Henceforward, Rahner's man-centered theology becomes wholly comprehensible, for it follows Hegel with an implacable logic. Everything becomes clear, and even quite simple. Rahner is Catholic theology transposed into the key of Hegel, with Teilhard de Chardin's biology as the variation on cosmic evolution, and Heidegger's historicism chiming in as theology. 2. The anthropological inversion. In the period between the world wars, man lost the sense of God. Rahner was haunted by a desire to save the men of his time and all mankind. For apostolic reasons, he wished to set up a theology which would intimately reunite God with his creatures and at the same time give due credit to modern philosophy. He longed to propose an all-encompassing fundamental sobre la fe, the Spanish edition of Grundkurs des Glaubens, Einführung in den Begriff des Christentums, Madrid, 1979, p.185, cf. The English edition, Foundations of Christian Faith, An Introduction to the Idea of Christianity, translated by Rahner, Foundations of Christian Faith, p.44, IBID, p.57, IBID, p.83. Rahner's anthropological inversion, Christianity, by working the world and God into his theological universe. What he produced was a vast movement, a tightly soldered chain leading from the Trinity to Christ and from Christ to man and the world, before the final return of all things to God. The central link in this chain and the center of Rahner's theology is man, which is why Rahner gave it the name of anthropological inversion, or man-centered turning 2018. It is a movement in three principal phases: the Trinitarian phase, the descending Christology. Rahner began his study of God with the Trinity of the divine persons, instead of with the unity of God. Why? According to existentialism, to be is to appear and to be revealed, such that God is unthinkable unless he appear in history. Here we see where Rahner was influenced by the Protestant Karl Barth. For Barth, the Trinity is the mystery of salvation and of God's communicating himself to man. This self-communication of God is divine. Revelation, and revelation is only perfect when the revealer identifies himself with the content revealed. Since the Son is the person doing the revealing in history, a revelation identical to the revealer demands the incarnation of the Word. Armed with this weapon, Rahner established the fundamental axiom of his entire theological system: the economics, Trinity, God for us in history, is the immanent. Trinity God in his eternal self, and conversely. 20. In the mind of Rahner, God is Trinity only when he is in communication with creation by the missions of the Word and the Holy Ghost. Accordingly, the eternal processions within the Trinity are identical with the missions of the second and third divine persons upon earth. 21. The Die C.F. Rahner, The Trinity, New York, Herder and Herder, 1970, p. 108. See below. Karl Barth, Dogma, Volume. A. Geneva, 1954, in Ferraro, El Naufragio del Progressismo, p. 91. Rahner, El Dios Trino, in Mysterium Salutis, Volume 2, K.H. V. Madrid, 1977, p. 278. The following analysis of Rahner is originally taken from Ferraro, El Naufragio, The Trinity, a translation by Joseph Donchel of the article in German on the present theme, Der dreifaltige Gott als Transzendenter der Heilsgeschichte in Die Heilsgeschichte vor Christus, Volume I-2 of the series Mysterium Salutis, Grundrisse as they are revealed and act in salvation history, immanent Trinity, the divine persons with respect to one another. 3. Persons in one God is essentially identical with the mystery of the self-communication of God to us in Christ and in His Spirit. CEF. Also the Trinity, p.64. 100 years of modernism vine. Persons are not distinct from their mode of communication. 22. And for Rahner, they seem to have no existence prior to such communication. The Son is the Father communicated. He is God historically extroverted in the world. Likewise for the Holy Ghost. The Trinity represents, so to speak, the Godward aspect of the two absolute communications of God, which are the hypostatic union and the grace which leads to glory. 23. The Trinity is a mystery whose paradoxical character is preluded in the paradoxical character of man's existence. 24. By strict logic, we can infer from Rahner's words that God is triune by his own free choice, since his existence as Trinity is dependent on his free creation of man. In his Christology, our Jesuit carefully followed Hegel's dialectic. God, to be revealed to himself, must utter his word, which is God alienated, yielding the dialectic, God incarnate word. God revealed to himself. The same axiom which Rahner applied to the Trinity, he next applied to descending Christology. If the immanent Trinity equals the historical, economic Trinity, then, by strict logic, the eternal Word equals the economic Word, and conversely 25. Just as the Trinity must communicate itself to be constituted Trinity, so if God is to manifest himself to himself by becoming the Word, then he must become man. Rahner exposed his thought in a series of texts which built upon one another toward a theological climax. The incarnation was necessary. It was a change within God. It was a true conversion, an alienation, and even a transubstantiation. The Son's procession from the Father is identical with the incarnation, which implies that the eternal Word is not prior to the incarnate Word. The Son is above all else the Father's self-communication to the world in such a way that he is radically to be found there, in that Son. 26. Rahner emphasized the words from the prelude to Saint produced. John's Gospel, the Word became flesh. What is this becoming of God made man? There was a true change within God when the Word became flesh, which is none other than the conversion of God into man. For if humanity is the means by which God shows himself and lives amongst us, then it is not something added onto the Word from the outside. This humanity is the Word. It is the result of God uttering statement as true, that no adequate distinction can be made between the doctrine of the Trinity and the doctrine of the economy of salvation. And p35, God relates to us in a threefold manner, and this threefold, free and gratuitous relation to us is not merely a copy or an analogy of the inner Trinity, but this Trinity itself, albeit as freely and gratuitously communicated. Then we can assert, in the full meaning of the words, here the Logos with God and the Logos with us, the immanent and the economic Logos, are strictly the same. The Trinity, p33, Rahner's Anthropological Inversion, himself 27. God's self-expression outwards and outside himself is as Word and as man. His man, Jesus Christ, is precisely as man. the self-expression of God in his self-emptying, because God expresses precisely himself if he empties himself. The 28. The incarnation is an annihilation and at the same time a conversion of God into man. 29. The incarnation is precisely the self-emptying of God, his becoming, the kenosis and genesis of God himself. 30. The links of the chain are unbroken from eternal word to incarnate word to human nature. The descending Christology is in turn the basis of Rahner's ascending Christology, the mystery of grace and of man's salvation. Once again, Rahner remained faithful to the Hegelian pattern. After the infinite has poured itself into the finite and identified itself therewith, we embark on the voyage home as the finite melts back into the supreme infinite. The point of convergence of these two movements is primarily the cosmos as it strives toward infinitude. Here Karl Rahner meets Teilhard de Chardin, beginning as he did with an evolving world which becomes man, because matter becomes spirit, and spirit little by little becomes God. 32. For Rahner, the discontinuity and essential difference between matter, life, consciousness, and spirit by no means excludes evolution if it is true that there is becoming, if becoming is or can be, in the true sense, an act of self, transcendence, if self-transcendence likewise is or can be at least an entitive self-transcendence. 33. Creation gravitates toward its summit, which is the Rahner, El Dios Trino, p. 284. Rahner, Foundations of Christian Faith, p. 222. Rahner, Concilium, Volume 3, German edition, 1982, p. 212. Unlimited transcend that is most besides our earth, and divides our earth, and if facts of self-communication in the cosmos is a earth, and if we assume that in fact this transcendentality in other places is also born by God's self-communication in grace, for grace is the reason for creation of order is the reason for fulfillment of freedom, which is of the same order as the relationship between God and goal is the fulfillment of freedom, will one day be subsumed to the fullness of God's self-communication to this material and spiritual cosmos, and that this will happen through many histories of freedom which do not only take place on modernism, hypostatic union, which is of the self-cosmos as always, and basically a history of the cosmoses of communication to spirit, and immediacy. It is in human nature that the Word emptied himself and begot himself. The same human nature is what opens man to the divine. Rahner says two things. Firstly, that man shares in the essence of the Word. Secondly, that he can be defined as the capacity to become Word and as the exteriorization of God. Firstly, the Word is perfectly defined as man. For what he is as the self-expression of the Logos, and what we are is the same. And the fact that he in his reality says exactly what we are renders the content of our essence and of our history redeemed, and opens it into the freedom of God. 37, to he incarnate. Logos has been called the abbreviated Word of God. The abbreviation, the cipher of God himself, is man, that is, the Son of Man and the men who exist ultimately because there was to be a Son of Man. 38. Tihi. Incarnation of God is the unique and highest instance of the actualization of the essence of human reality, which consists in this, that man is insofar as he abandons himself to the absolute mystery whom we call God. Secondly, man is defined as a possibility of God. For Rahner, the creator-creature relationship is structured like a question and answer, because each calls for and implies the other. Man appears as the configuration, or counter-image, or temporal symmetry of God. Today, we would say, man is God's photographic negative. Man is the temporal place of God, or rather God's existence. 40. For this reason, the primary definition of man. Rahner, Schriften zur Theologie, Vol. I, English translation by Cornelius Ernst, O.P., Theological Investigations, Vol. I, God, Christ, Mary, and Grace, Current Problems in Rahner, Foundations of Christian Faith, pt. 91, IBID, pt. 95, EBID, p. 224, IBID, pp. 288. In other words, man is God's existence outside of himself, his outstanding. Rahner's anthropological inversion is the non-God who can become God's self-exteriorization and possible brother of Christ. 41. When God wants to be what is not God, man comes to be. 42. Ultimately, Rahner identified nature with supernature by a proof in 3 stages. 1. A state of pure nature is inconceivable, Bust 1. A non-historical state of man is impossible, Bust 1. An historical state of man always implies his ordination toward the beatific vision, and finally toward the incarnation, Port 4.3. In this way, in what we call grace and the immediate vision of God, God is really an intrinsic, constitutive principle of man. 44. And man is a being of transcendence towards the holy and absolutely real mystery. 45. Men, as creatures, must be understood as the possibility of being able to be assumed, of being the material for a possible history of God when He establishes them from out of nothing in their own non-divine reality as the grammar of God's possible self-expression. 46. Rahner's tendency to identify the human and divine natures with one another in this way logically leads to identity between the 2 different texts form a suggestive summary of Rahner's thinking. If God Himself is man and remains so for all eternity, if therefore all theology is eternally anthropology, if it is forbidden to man to think little of himself because he would then be thinking little of God, and if this God remains the insoluble mystery, then man is for all eternity the expression of the mystery of God which participates for all eternity in the mystery of its ground. 47. Because the hypostatic union is the union of the real essence of God and of man in God's personal self-expression in His eternal Logos. For this reason, Christology is the beginning, and the infinite must exteriorize itself and alienate itself by casting itself into the finite, ultimately to emerge as the self-aware infinite, according to Hegel's pattern as revised by Teilhard de Chardin. As with Hegel, Rahner's evolutionary system links together without a break matter, spirit capacity of human nature, supernature, natural desire for the Rahner, El Dios Trino, p. 349. Wishes to step freely outside of himself, he must create man, Ibid, p. 217, Ibid, p. 221, Ibid, p. 21, Ibid, p. 223, Ibid, p. 225, Ibid. 100 Years of Modernism Incarnation. Point T9. In brief, just as God needs history to establish His threeness, just as the Word cannot be Word unless He is incarnate, so God needs the world in order to be God. When it comes to applying Hegel's dialectic, one has to admit that Rahner is ruthlessly logical. 3. Applications of the anthropological inversion. Up to this point, Rahner has explained the relationship between God and the world in terms of the Hegelian dialectic of opposite poles of attraction, allowing contraries to be united in a superior harmony. The same philosophy of an awareness opening onto the infinite goes on to provide the rest of theology with theses which have now become classic in modern theology. Identifying nature with grace and man with God, for example, were 2 staples of the theology that has since become the power-driving ecumenism. Now God and the grace of Christ are present as the secret essence of every reality we can choose. Consequently, anyone who, though still far from any revelation explicitly formulated in words, accepts His existence in patient silence, is saying yes to Christ even if he does not know it. Anyone who accepts His humanity fully, and all the more so, of course, the humanity of others, has accepted the Son of Man because in Him God has accepted man. 50. Since Christ united Himself to every man through His incarnation, the grace given in view of Christ is precisely the condition for saving oneself by appropriating God's salvation freely. 51. From this blurring of the natural and supernatural orders there flows a whole series of consequences which we will consider in detail. Natural revelation, the explosion of the Church into a multitude of creeds, universal salvation, unbounded ecumenism, and situation ethics. Faithful to existentialism, Rahner bases religion on a personal and inward experience of God, magnified by successive revelations of being. Thus, public revelation must yield precedence to personal revelation. To become a true theologian in his church, no man should take the faith of his parents seriously. Point 52. The fact that Christ lived, died, and rose again at a particular time and in a particular place in history certainly lends clarity and a tangible and concrete character to church piety, but it is also a weakness, because it will always be a fact limited in time and space. Point 53 of EBID, Pi 228. EBID, P283. Rahner, Teologia dall'Esperienza, dello Spirito, la Tradizione Cattolica, number 40, p.728. Cf. Rahner, Schriften zur Theologie, Volume 12, First Part, English translation by David Moreland, OSB, Theological Investigations, Volume Afters. XVI Experience of the Spirit, Rahner's Anthropological Inversion course, the primary experience of God, is only thinkable as an experience of God inseparable from the transcendence of man, as the horizon of that transcendence. Point 54. The divine causation of the a priori horizon of our knowledge and freedom must be characterized as a specific and original mode of revelation, indeed even as the mode upon which all other revelation is based. The ramifications for ecclesiology are obvious. Any belief, whatever its creed, is able to save man because what matters is inner feeling. Any piety in sincere conformity with conscience is able to save, upheld by grace, and is in a certain sense already Christian, but anonymously. An atheist can perfectly well be saved as an anonymous Christian, even if he explicitly refuses to be associated in any way with the visible and hierarchical church. Point 56. Such a way of seeing things radically modifies our understanding of the church. For Rahner, the people of God is not a ghetto church. Yet when the boundaries of Christ's church are burst so wide, of what further use is the Roman Catholic Church? The church is not so much the exclusive community of candidates for salvation, as the historical and social vanguard of that hidden reality. 57. Next, within the church herself, the very concept of authority is called into question. If church authorities act on church members, they must never forget that the church is made up of persons whose dignity consists in their inalienable liberty. Since the church exists to bring her members to a personal meeting with God in charity, then they must be left free to follow the workings of the charismatic spirit, which are always present. The duty of the authority is to offer to individuals directly inspired by God the means to express within the church a sane and orderly public opinion. 58. Reading these texts, we can understand why Rahner's most original contribution to Vatican II was collegiality, the democratization of the church. As for egological morality, the simple fact of becoming aware of the greatness of God automatically ensures salvation. Even an atheist can perfectly well be saved as an anonymous Christian. However, salvation for the atheist is problematic, particularly for the existentialist in Rahner, who would believe that ultimately there is no such thing as the subconscious. How can Rahner hold that the pagan who utters blasphemy against the name of Jesus Christ still has faith in the same Jesus Christ? 59. How Rahner, Foundations of Christian Faith, p55. Rahner, Teologia dall'Esperienza dello Spirito, la Tradizione Cattolica, p.715, cf. Rahner, Saggi di Cristologia et Mariologia, San Paolo Edizione, 1967, p.569. These libertarian principles bore their fruit in Rahner's disciple Hans Kung, with his outrageous insubordination towards church leaders. Rahner rapidly dissociated himself from this troublesome pupil who was discrediting his ideas. 100 years of modernism, can a pagan subconsciously accept God when he consciously denies him? Rahner's solution, faithful to Kant's transcendentalism, was to divide in two the internal forum of the conscience. There is, on the one hand, a clearly known object of the consciousness, yet there is also an underlying structure to the consciousness which is automatically open to grace, for it is the proper theater of God's self-revelation. The depths of the being in which God communicates himself will never be sounded, and therefore a man is capable of openly denying God and at the same time radically loving him. 6d. This division of the consciousness is the basis for his distinction between venial sin, grave sin, and mortal sin, a triple distinction unknown to pre-Vatican. 2 Catechisms. Mortal sin is a fault which implicates the person absolutely and in his very foundations, but which can never be truly recognizable. Hence the radical impossibility of ever truly reforming a fundamental option gone awry. Hence, too, the impossibility of ever knowing absolutely whether or not such an attempt to reform has been successful. We never know with ultimate certainty whether we really are sinners. Nobody can know if what seems really to be a sin is absolutely a sin in the internal forum of the conscience. Vagueness and lack of definition are the hallmark of existentialist morals. A systematic moral ignorance reigns over the conscience as conceived by Rahner, but, ultimately, he advocated an alternative to this systematic ignorance, and that is radical impeccability. For, in the last analysis, Rahner's system renders it impossible for man to refuse God once and for all because the subject would then cease to exist. 4. Criticism of Rahner's system. Tyrrell, as a child, supposedly reveled in dismantling his toys and piecing them back together again, a foreshadowing of his theological labors. Rahner, on the other hand, became the master of that game which takes place inside the mind and excludes all outside realities. As a faithful existentialist, he based everything exclusively on human consciousness, which alone exists and which alone is the absolute source of all things. Ibid. p.1n4. According to the theories of the personalist philosophy, man creates himself insofar as he acts freely. Man is a transcendent being, that is to say, an incommunicable individual with his unique experiences, and it is doubtful whether his nature remains the same for the duration of his existence. This vagueness is what enables human nature to be disengaged from the natural law, and opens the floodgate to exceptions. Hence, there can be a clash between the natural law and human nature. This existentialist morality is the permissive morality preached by Herring, the factotum of today's moral theology, with the approval of his friend Rahner, the denial of natural law, creative liberty, situation ethics, and the new medical ethics. Rahner, Foundations of Christian Faith, PW 102. Rahner's anthropological inversion. There exists nothing beyond the domain of the consciousness, which bestows existence and veracity on all it sees. For Rahner, the will dictates all thought, and thought makes and unmakes reality like soft putty in the hands of a child. Radical existentialist that he was, Rahner identified being with knowledge and freedom, cogito volo, raising human consciousness to a state of equality with God and attributing to it God's creative power. We have already described this principle as the original sin of introverted existentialism. 64. Muddling through theology with these fundamentally egological principles, the original sin of all modern thought, Rahner succeeded in equating God with pure spirit, that is, equating him with a vacuous consciousness and the vacuum of the consciousness. He mistook the truth, which is the good of the mind, for freedom freed from all restraints, which is the absence of being and good. Once again, we can see Heidegger's nihilism raising its ugly head and Rahner escaping it only by stretching the logic of its principles. However, these principles of egological philosophy are not intellectually satisfying. With these principles, Rahner's system stands or falls. His worldview must be accepted totally or rejected totally. His brilliant synthesis is the work of an unbounded genius, but with a fatal flaw. His brilliant connection of ideas fails to reflect a connection of realities. Rahner's work is like a castle, magnificent and well built, but a castle in the sky, the stuff Don Quixote's dreams were made of. It crumbles when confronted with reality, when compared with the metaphysics of being, when brought under the light of the true faith. Deep cracks riddle the structure of Rahner's fortress. The underlying metaphysics holding the system together is itself flawed. The principles which make up its strength are also its weakness. These principles are nothing new. We have already hashed and rehashed them in previous chapters. Kant's transcendentalism is willfully ignorant and deliberately leaves a doubt hanging over the relationship between man and God. The philosophy of consciousness is viscerally egological. Rahner never stepped out of the reductionist circle of immanentism. I think, it exists. From within the egological prison, there is no proving exterior reality or being, and still less absolute being, for an idea can only beget an idea. A painted coat rack can only sustain a painted coat. Last but not least, Ranner adopted the dialectical method of Hegel, by which all things evolve from the great whole through the cosmos back to the whole. Unfortunately for Ranner, this sort of method, Unit 64, Fabro la Svolta Antropologica Decay, Ranner, p.190, deduces that this new transcendental anthropology sets itself up as an absolute science based on the totally unfounded principle that being, mind, and will are all the same thing. When man identifies I want with I think, and then with it is, what more does he need to dethrone God? 100 years of modernism in contraries in order to supersede them leads to flat contradiction. The Hegelian absolute is the infinite, but it is also the finite, such that the infinite becomes the finite, and the finite transcends its own bounds to become the absolute infinite. It means that the infinite enters into relation with itself by means of a creature, and that the unchanging has changed to become aware of itself and so attain perfection. It means that the more has the power to become the less, and that the infinite has passed over into another and taken it on as other. It means that being is fundamentally fissured, and that the unconditioned has a condition to fulfill, namely, to create man in order more fully to become God, for without the world, God is not God. 65 Ranner's theology rises like a charmed serpent from modern metaphysics, tight and powerful, but its unity is deceptive. Ranner claimed Heidegger as his sole mentor. In fact, he was first and foremost Hegelian and only afterwards Heideggerian. His system is very eclectic, with all of the inherent drawbacks, lack of organization, contradictory viewpoints, gaps between segments artificially pieced together. Now Hegel and Heidegger, not to mention saints and saint-mean, Thomas really did have widely divergent philosophies. Ranner departed most radically from Heidegger when he took the anthropocentric turnoff, identifying theology and philosophy in an attempt to introduce God into the system. Heidegger could not conceive of any revelation independent of one's consciousness. On the contrary, any genuine existentialist is trapped forever in the prison of the self-sufficient human consciousness. Philosophy should not address the problem of God, all the while respecting the particular genius of theology. To pull out of this rut, driving straight toward the death of theology, Ranner was obliged to have recourse to an unhoped-for means. If he did so, it was by sheer willpower, and contrary to the direction of his principles. Ranner was not faithful to his master Heidegger in philosophy. He was no more faithful to Catholicism. Ranner's metaphysics takes its starting point in the human consciousness, deducing from it firstly being and then man as mediator for God. Now, this is the exact opposite of Thomism. So how can Ranner quote Saint Thomas on every page of his philosophy and deduce from it the exact opposite of Thomism? What might have been excused as the author's misreading can be no such thing when we see him attacking the very foundations of realism and systematically invoking Saint Parable. Hegel, Philosophie der Religion. Leipzig, 1925. I-22 in Ferraro, El Naufragio del Progressismo, p. 376. He found this means in the teaching of his fellow Jesuit, the Belgian Fer04 Hay Maréchal, who claimed that the egological transcendental experience is ultimately one with the down to saying that if God is possible, then he exists. If God is thought, then he is Ranner's. Anthropological inversion. Thomas, to prove the opposite of Thomism. What holds true for philosophy holds just as true for theology. Ranner admits with hesitation that he is an amateur theologian and that he has never seriously studied the key treatises of Thomism on God. And yet he was much worse than just an amateur theologian. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing, cloaking himself in Thomism in order to justify the most corrosive anti-Thomism. How could Ranner set himself up as a Catholic theologian when he explained the fundamental mysteries of our faith as a sort of pantheism, thereby denying the most elementary distinctions? We can understand why Farrar. Fabro, full of Italian vehemence, spares no invective to castigate the enemy. He accuses Rahner of being a systematic distorter, a contizer, crashing around amongst Thomistic theses like a deaf man at a musical concert. He defines Rahner as a confused mystifier churning out meaningless prose in a barbaric, hallucinatory style. Fabro dubs him the standard-bearer of immanent Christianity and the pirate of contemporary theology. 67. That is why Cardinal Siri pronounces a severe judgment on Rahner, for his thought is the way not of truth, but of error, as all of the principles, criteria, and foundations of the faith are systematically called in question. We have already pointed out the confusion of God with man and of nature with grace at the source of all Rahner's theology. Actually, an even more fundamental motivation behind his theology is ecumenism. Rahner starts out from the praiseworthy but unreal desire to wish to save all men. His reasoning is simple but fallacious. Since God is almighty and wishes to save all men, then God indeed saves all men. The mere realization of God's majesty automatically brings salvation. Every man alive is an anonymous Christian even if he explicitly refuses to be associated in any way with the visible and hierarchical church. Outside the church, salvation. The kingdom of God on earth is all mankind, such that all men are saved. That is why, if hell exists, it is empty. 69. The people of God is not the ghetto church, it is the broader church, subsisting in but not confined to the Catholic Church. This thesis of universal salvation leads directly into a new notion of the apostolate, paralyzing the missionary effort by rendering it obsolete, and this for two reasons. Firstly, if we Fabro, La Svolta Antropologica de K. Rahner, texts collected by Innocenti, Influssi Gnostici, nella Chiesa d'oggi, p. 48, Siri, Gethsemane, p. 86. Many others think as he does, in particular Ratzinger and John Paul II, CHA. 19 of this broader church, voted into being by Vatican II, which sees means of salvation in other religions of the world, not only differs from, but is actually opposed to the people of God in Scripture, as Ratzinger pointed out in 1966. 100 years of modernism identify nature with grace. Surely this means that all men are in the state of grace. If grace equals nature, then every man who has a human nature also has the state of grace and is living in grace, whether he is aware of it or not. Secondly, every man can be Christ's brother and hence a Christian, such that a man deliberately anti-Christian can still be Christian. What could now be the use of crossing oceans and shedding one's blood to render explicit what all men already possess implicitly, the certainty of eternal salvation? Yves Conger put it in a nutshell. Today nobody can claim that any need to save souls from hell is what accounts for the missions. God saves them without their knowing the gospel. Otherwise, we should all leave for China. 71. The missionary effort becomes the demissionary effort, the dismissal of the missions. And, if every man is an implicit Christian, vocations will become revocations, the revoking of apostolic zeal. 5. Rahner's theology, the ultimate in modernism. Rahner claimed that the only way to speak of God in a secularized, man-centered society is to draw religion out of man himself. The effort to found just such a man-centered theology is the whole thrust of his book, The Anthropological Inversion. Rahner's theology would supplant traditional theology, which defined exactly how God is united to man by constructing, as it were, a great suspension bridge buttressed on God's transcendence and the supernatural redemption of mankind by Christ. On the contrary, Rahner's theology does not come down from above, as God reveals himself to man, but rather rises from below, as man stretches beyond his limits and naturally aligns himself with God. The Hegelian system is intrinsically pantheistic. Only with difficulty could Rahner avoid the same accusation. His, of course, is not the obvious kind of pantheism, blatantly identifying God with the world. Instead, it is Hegelian pantheism which, without suppressing the finite, nevertheless absorbs it and preserves it as a stage intrinsic to the formation of the great whole, since the Hegelian absolute is not the infinite God, but the present synthesis of infinite and finite. Certain of Rahner's texts are gravely compromising. When we say against pantheism that God and the world are different, this statement is radically misunderstood if it is interpreted in a dualistic way. The difference between God and the world is of such a nature that God establishes and is the difference of the world from himself, and for this reason he establishes the closest unity precisely in the differentiation. Jean Puyot interroge le Père Congar, Une vie pour la vérité, Paris, Centurion, 1975, p.175. To Conger, do we owe the ecumenical decrees of Vatican II, see the end of chapter 21. Rahner, Foundations of Christian Faith, .62. Rahner's anthropological inversion. We are facing the single reality, the inconceivably lofty mystery deciding my fate and that of the world, because it presupposes the very fate of God, and hence that of the world. 7333. And this self-communication God does not originally cause and produce something different from himself in the creature, but rather he communicates his own divine reality and makes it a constitutive element in the fulfillment of the creature. 474. Tied his very own reality of God's, which he can no longer undo as something which has been surpassed, must exist. It is in no way surprising to see even a colleague as radical as Casper looking askance at such a venture as being uncomfortably close to pantheistic Gnosticism. Nor is the notion of evolution at the heart of Rahner's system apt to remove the suspicion of pantheism hanging over it. According to Rahner, God evolves from indeterminate to determinate by a process of theogenesis, cosmogenesis, and anthropogenesis, all rolled into one in the history of the world and of God. Mankind is God developed to his fullest potential, and God becomes one with the world. Behold the paradigm of unity, wiping out all division between nature and grace, church and world, faith and reason, God and creature, in a promotion of religious syncretism, since salvation comes from the human consciousness. Rahner considers man and world as one reality ordered to a supernatural end because God and the grace of Christ are in everything, like the secret essence of every reality. 77. By the fact that the Word of God became man, humanity has already in advance become ontologically the real sanctification of individual men by grace, and also the people of the children of God. 78. Whoever totally accepts his own humanity, and of course his neighbor's humanity, and of course his neighbor's humanity, Rahner in Ferraro, El Naufragio del Progressismo, p. 459. Rahner, Foundations of Christian Faith, p. 121. Ebed, p. 31, Walter Casper, Jesus to Christus, English translation by V. Green, Jesus, the Christ, about Rahner's position in Gethsemane, p.79. Rahner, Sagi di Christologia, p. 129. Rahner, Schriften zur Theologie, Volume 2, English translation by Carl H. Kruger, Theological Investigations, Volume Portency. I2, Man in the Church, Membership of the Church. According to the teaching of Pius XII's encyclical Mystici. Corpus Christi, Baltimore, Helicon Press, 1963, p. 100 Years of Modernism 2 has accepted the Son of Man since, in him, God has accepted man. 79. We have here a major confusion of nature and grace, taken up by all of the spokesmen of the new theology, and issuing logically in pantheism. We have already pointed out that from the confusion between the natural and supernatural orders flows a true avalanche of consequences: natural revelation, pluralism of creeds, universal salvation, the anonymous Christian, hell empty, the bursting of the Roman ghetto church, unlimited ecumenism. However, the contradiction between sane Catholic thinking and Hegelian theology is most acute when we come to the study of the Trinity and of Christ, taken theologically or philosophically. Monism, monophysitism, Nestorianism, modalism, ontologism, idealism, immanentism, Pelagianism, pantheism, every possible error finds a home in Rahner's system, 8d. For him, the Trinity, grace, the Incarnation. The basic Christian mysteries are incomprehensible without reference to man. Nor did he stop there. He attacked the very notion of God's liberty by claiming that the incarnation and the gift of grace were not free divine initiatives. Fabro highlights a number of aspects of Rahner's Hegelian pantheism: the confusion between intellection and sensation, man's self-birth, and man's non-existence except as universal man. These are not new ideas because Teilhard de Chardin was saying, in effect, the same thing. The creed of the New Age is no different. Rahner's system can be seen as the ripe fruit of modernism going back many centuries, and it comes as no surprise that it is the point where all heresies meet together. Is it going too far to state that Rahner takes the destructive principles of modernism as far as they can go? Has he not brought forth a work which, though masterful as a logical construction, is nevertheless the very opposite of the Christian vision of God and the world? Rahner represents the ultimate in the corruption of divine vis Rahner. Fundamentos de la Protologia in Mysterium Salutis, Volume 2, in Ferraro, p. 55. Without reflection, he accepts God when he freely accepts himself in his own unlimited transcendence. Thinking due to its existentialist and egological structure, Rahner speaks of the triple God and of Catholic polytheism in a way unforgivable for a theologian. Yea. Ankerberg and Weldon, The Facts on the New Age Movement, p. 20, cited in Modernisme, in the review. Action Familiale et Scolaire, p. 22, summed up the New Age creed as follows: Man is in himself good and divine, so he contains within himself all he needs for time and eternity. Salvation consists in the development of psychic powers and higher states of awareness. This is achieved by introspection and by practicing New Age techniques in such a way as to attain once and for all the awareness of one's own divinity. Sin is the ignorance of one's own divinity. Jesus Christ is one of the masters of the New Age, an example of what an enlightened individual can do once he has realized that he is God. God is an impersonal energy penetrating everything. Rahner's anthropological inversion. Dom and hence inhuman folly in the strictest sense. The coherence of his system is far superior to that of Teilhard de Chardin's Christic evolution, because the Frenchman merely lost himself in the fog of a mystical biology, lacking as he was any precise metaphysical principles. Rahner, on the contrary, pushes his theological edifice as far as it will go, propped up on modern philosophy. His theology is the logical fruit of modern philosophy and exegesis, already emptied of their proper object. Rahner provides the proof ad absurdum that theology depends on sane metaphysics. His system represents the ultimate in modernism, the omega point of a science gone wrong and finally self-destructive. Fabro hits the nail on the head. Without a transcendent God, creator of the world and of man, there is no I, existing as the impregnable center of liberty. Without the man-God, redeemer and sanctifier, immanent in history as true man and transcendent in eternity as true God, in the words of the Council of Chalcedonia, there is no hope of salvation. Indeed, without metaphysics there can be no theology. After this overview, it should be clear to anybody that Rahner was an architect of genius in the construction of an impregnable bunker. All the delicate points of theology, both dogmatic and moral, are drawn by a sort of enchantment out of the egological consciousness, dancing to the tune of the Hegelian waltz. Seen in a different light, Rahner's theological construct is not the theology of tradition but of treason. It is indeed an inversion. He named it the anthropological inversion, but he would have done well to call it the narcissistic inversion, the adoration of self. It is an inversion not unlike the sin of the angels. It is perhaps the most perfect philosophical and theological expression here below of the sin of Lucifer, wanting to become like God and letting out his cry of revolt. As far as bunkers go, Rahner has, with his intellectual synthesis, dug out a cave with no beauty, life, or being. It is exactly the reverse of Christian culture based on God, on Jesus Christ, and in the end, on being. Fabro, La Aventura Progresista, p. 319.